In this game from the World Championship of 1894, Emanuel Lasker plays a move that a modern engine might suggest. It's Stockfish, or one of the modern neural network engines, really showing us there is nothing new under the sun, and there is immense knowledge that we can get from these classic players. This is a game I really think you're going to enjoy. Emanuel Lasker has white. Steinitz, the world champion at the time, had black. Let us jump right in. Lasker begins with e4, Steinitz e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, and no surprise, Steinitz plays the Steinitz defense to the Ruy Lopez. More common these days is a6 first, but d6 was an idea. Basically, he wanted to equalize with black and then try to outplay his opponent later in the game. And Lasker immediately plays d4, taking advantage of the pin on the knight at c6. Bishop to d7, Steinitz relieves the pin on that knight. Knight to c3, and knight g to e7. One of the ideas of this move is to play the knight to g6, where it can overprotect the strong point at e5, but also jump in later to the f4 square, which would be very well placed. Lasker just develops naturally. Bishop to e3, adding to his control of the d4 square, and now knight to g6, as we just mentioned, particularly overprotecting this e5 pawn. Queen to d2 from Lasker, bishop to e7, and now we see that both sides have all of their minor pieces completely developed. They really respected development at that time, and they wanted to get their pieces out as quickly as possible, and we see both sides have done that. A long castling for Lasker, a6, hitting that bishop at b5 and asking the question. He doesn't really want to take the knight because then that would give black the bishop pair, and he doesn't want to give the bishop pair to Steinitz. So he instead retreats the bishop to e2 and just settles for the fact that he has a bit more space in the center. It would be a mistake probably for Steinitz to castle here. White gets comfortable play after pawn takes pawn. Black cannot retake with his d pawn because of the pin down the d file. He would just win the bishop at d7. So black would need to retake with the knight, and after knight takes f4. Lasker is beginning to get space and an initiative on the king's side. So Steinitz does not want to allow that. So he goes ahead and takes on d4. That does give more space to white after he recaptures this e4 pawn versus this d6 pawn, but black has a little more room to breathe. He can move his bishop to f6 and so forth. A knight takes knight. Now, it would be a mistake, probably, strategically, to take with the bishop. The idea is that after this move, black can play bishop to g5, which pins the queen to the king, and white would be forced to retreat his bishop back to e3. Then those bishops come off, and this space advantage isn't quite as useful as it would be if all of the pieces were still on the board. You know, if you have a space advantage, you want to keep as many pieces on the board as possible to make it hard for your opponent to maneuver their own pieces. Anyway, because of that, Lasker goes ahead and takes on d4 with the queen. Bishop to f6, hits the queen, places the bishop on a nice diagonal. The queen goes back to d2. Steinitz has less space, but he is solid here. Bishop to d6, applying some pressure to the e4 pawn. And here, Lasker jumps in with knight to d5, really going after that bishop pair. And of course, the knight on d5 is well placed here. And Steinitz goes ahead and castles. And at this point, Lasker played a move that the chess players of that time really probably did not understand. Kasparov, in analyzing this game, said that the players of that era did not understand this modern concept. And it's the kind of move we see all the time now with the influence of computers, and it's the move g4. We see g4 all the time now, but at that time it was very rare to just launch the g-pawn the way Lasker does in this game. By the way, a little bit better actually was h4, also a modern idea. The safe move and the expected move at that time would have just been f3, being solid. But Lasker goes ahead and plays g4, and Steinitz, the world champion, handles it fairly well, actually. First thing he does is he applies pressure directly to the e-pawn with his rook, g5, attacking that bishop at f6. Now bishop takes knight. It would be a mistake for white to take with the pawn, actually, because Steinitz, could play a very nice exchange sacrifice with rook takes e3. he would need to take with the pawn, and after bishop g5, black gets plenty of compensation for that rook, and he takes with the queen. Bishop g5 would pin that queen, and the game would be over. So that was a possibility. So to avoid that, Lasker goes ahead and takes on d5 with his queen instead, but that allows this move, rook to e5, attacking the queen and attacking the pawn at g5. So he plays queen to d2. Now he is continuing to defend that pawn at g5, and it looks like if Steinitz were to take that pawn, Lasker could play f4 and fork the rook and the bishop. But Steinitz has seen a little deeper than that, and he goes ahead and grabs that pawn. Looks like he's going to lose a piece, but he does not. This was a very strong idea from Steinitz. f4, played by Lasker, forking those two pieces. This is Steinitz's idea. He takes on e4 with his rook. Then when Lasker takes the bishop, which was played in the game, Steinitz played queen to e7, and that is how he gets his piece back, attacking the two bishops, and white has to defend one, but he cannot defend the other. The best move from Lasker here was actually bishop to f3, but after rook takes e3, bishop b7, rook to b8, he could play rook h to e1 to get one pair of rooks off of the board first. When those rooks come off, this is survivable perhaps for white with a better minor piece, but he is down a pawn here. And that was probably the best way to play. But instead he plays rook d to f1. And we'll see what his idea is. Basically, he's applying pressure to the f7 pawn. That's his idea. Rook goes ahead and takes the bishop at e3, but now bishop to c4, directly attacking the pawn at f8. And here, Steinitz begins to lose his way a little bit. The best defensive move here was probably just rook to f8. But he plays knight to h8. And that's not a terrible move, but it's not quite as good. I think the issue was he was worried about h4, which is what Lasker played next, and the idea that if the knight were still on g6, h5 would irritate that knight, and maybe he wanted to avoid that. But this knight on h8 is a little passive. Well, maybe more than a little passive. But it does serve a defensive purpose. He plays c6 because he wants to play d5 and push Lasker's bishop to d3 off of this diagonal, aiming directly at the f7 pawn. So Lasker, knowing he's down two pawns, but he has an attack, he's got to go for it, right? And he plays a move, this was reminiscent of the kind of move Mikhail Tal would play many decades later. He plays the move g6, immediately applying pressure and forcing, I mean, it's his pawn sacrifice, but he's trying to open lines, and obviously he's putting a lot of pressure on f7. After d5, well, excuse me, that was played in the game. After hg6, h5, gh5, rook h5. White gets some counterplay, but black looks to be a little bit better here. After rook to e8, he's threatening to trade off two heavy pieces with rook to e1 check, and it looks like he would have been better in that situation. But instead, Steinitz plays d5. Probably not the most precise move. This really lets Lasker back into the game. And he takes on h7 with check and gets some serious counterplay. The king takes the pawn, which he needs to do, obviously. Bishop to d3 check, king to g8, and now h5. So Lasker has these two open files. He's got a bishop aiming in this direction, and he can use this h-pawn as a lever. So black is starting to sweat a little bit. White has generated some real pressure with that g4 idea. Rook to e8, tripling on the open file. h6, g6 to keep lines closed. You wouldn't want to open up the lines by taking that pawn. That would be a terrible decision. So g6, trying to keep it locked up, but now h7 check, king to g7. So if white were to magically be able to place his queen on d2 on the h6 square, that would be checkmate, right? So white wants to get that queen to h6, and black wants to stop it, and that explains some of the moves that follow in this position. The first thing he does is he plays king to b1. Now, it looks like queen to h2, directly aiming at h6, would be a good move, but then black could play queen to g5. Not only does that defend g6, it sets up a discovered attack against the white king at c1, and Lasker wanted to avoid that, and that is why he played the king to b1 first. Now, this threat of going into h2 is quite powerful. So he plays queen to e5, Steinitz does, to keep the queen from landing on the h2 square. a3 is played just to give him some air and remove any back rank threats. that black might have. c5, Steinitz begins to attack. The move c4 could come, even c3, wrecking the pawns on the queen side. Queen to f2. Now he's threatening the queen h4 pathway to the h6 square. c4 is played by Steinitz. Queen to h4. And by the way, he cannot block with the queen because queen to f6 check wins everything and the queen is gone. And that would be that. So he has to come up with a different idea. He doesn't have time to take the bishop on d3. So he goes ahead and plays f6. The idea is after queen to h6 check, the king can move over to f7 and perhaps survive the onslaught. Here, Lasker plays a very creative move that for the moment saves the bishop, bishop to f5. Now, it looks like it doesn't save a bishop, and the pawn can just take the bishop, right? Well, if the pawn takes the bishop, then after rook h to g1, king over, queen to h5 check, king to e7, white gets a lot of counterplay in this position. Just a sample line, rook g7 check, king d6, rook takes f5, hitting the queen. After queen to e6, queen to h2 check, blocking with the rook. Then queen to f2, actually threatening mate for the moment on b6. And white gets enough play. It's probably still theoretically equal because black has the extra piece, but white gets all the counterplay he needs to hold the position. So instead, Steinitz, plays king to f7 first, does not take that bishop, but then rook h to g1, and then he does go ahead and take the bishop. So we do end up in lines similar to the ones we just saw. Queen to h5 check, king to e7, and instead of checking on g7, Lasker plays the rook all the way to g8, which puts a lot of pressure on black. Obviously, he's threatening to capture on e8, and if black were to take on g1, then he would just take it with the pawn and promote to a queen, and obviously he would be completely winning in that case. So king to d6 is played by Steinitz to allow the queen to defend the rook, along with his other rook. And then rook to f5 was played by Lasker. And here, the move that Steinitz needed to play was rook to e1 check. That was the key idea. After king to a2, queen to e2, offering the exchange of queens. And after rook to d5 check, king c6, rook c5, king to b6, the queens come off, but this pawn is falling, this knight is stuck, and the computers see this as an equal endgame. White has sufficient compensation, but it's equal. But here Steinitz makes a mistake. He plays the move queen to e6, and that really allows Lasker to apply serious pressure. Rook takes e1. Another idea was queen to h2 check. He could generate counterplay that way, but he goes ahead and takes on e8. Queen takes e8, rook f6 check, and black's king is in real trouble here. If he blocks with the rook, he would lose instantly to this shocking move, queen takes queen. The rook cannot take the queen because it is pinned by white's rook at f6. So he plays king to c5 instead. Queen to h6 with a very nasty threat. He's threatening rook to f8, which would attack the knight and the queen. The queen is still eyeing that rook on e3. So Steinitz plays an interesting defensive idea. He plays rook to e7. And for the moment, that prevents rook to f8. Rook to e7. Yeah, rook to f8 because of this shot, rook to h7. And that would actually save black. He saves his knight in this position by counterattacking white's queen. So Lasker avoids that and instead plays queen to h2, threatening queen to d6 check, which would lead eventually to mate if black doesn't do anything about it. So Steinitz plays queen to d7 to control that d6 square. Now queen to g1 check from Lasker, and then when the pawn advances, queen to g5 check. A powerful idea, and basically the king has nowhere to go. And the next move from black is forced, queen to d5. But that, of course, allows rook to f5, pinning the queen to the king. Queen takes rook, queen takes, king d6, and the final move of the game, boom, queen to f6 check. A double attack on the king, hitting the knight at h8, and the game was over. And, of course, eventually, as we know, Lasker won the match and became the second world champion. Now, even after going over this great game from Emanuel Lasker, there are still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you need to see is in this video right here, So be sure to watch that next for some really amazing chess. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. Goodbye.